They had laughed at her the first day she carried that battered old rifle onto the field, a relic of another era with wood so worn it looked like it belonged in a museum, not in the hands of someone expected to compete in precision shooting, and the jeers came quick from the men around her who carried polished, modern weapons with shining optics and advanced ballistic systems, men who believed technology alone made them masters of the long shot, but she ignored the mockery and simply checked her weapon in silence, adjusting the strap across her shoulder and tightening the bolt with a movement so practiced it seemed like ritual, and in those quiet motions there was history, the kind of history that none of them could see, because her rifle had been passed down to her from her grandfather, a man who had once been a soldier when the odds were stacked even higher, and he had taught her how to listen to the wind, to feel the earth under her body, to breathe with the beat of her heart. Until she could sense the bullet's path before it left the barrel, and while they sneered at the weight of wood and steel she carried, she remembered nights on the mountain with frost in her lungs as she held that rifle steady at distances no scope should have allowed, learning patience in ways that their expensive technology could never give them. And so when the challenge came she did not shy away. She stepped forward when the instructors asked who would attempt the impossible, a 2-mile shot across a barren desert valley where mirage lines wavered like ghosts and the target shimmered almost invisible in the heat, and the men laughed again, some calling out that her rifle could barely reach the distance, others betting that she would embarrass herself and prove what they had said all along, but she simply laid herself flat against the ground, drawing the rifle close, pressing her cheek to the cold worn stock, closing her eyes for a moment to remember the voice of her grandfather telling her that the rifle only mattered if the shooter believed in it, and when she opened them again there was no sound, no laughter, no doubt in her mind, only the pulse of the earth and the thin thread of wind weaving across the valley, and she began to calculate without needing charts or devices, only instinct, the angle of the sun, the faint flutter of dust near a rock, the way the grass bent, and she set her sights so slowly that the crowd grew restless, mocking her again for hesitation. But she wasn't listening because hesitation was survival, patience was accuracy, and when her finger finally touched the trigger the world contracted into a single point, the crack of the rifle splitting the silence, the recoil driving into her shoulder, and then the long waiting silence as the bullet carried itself over the impossible stretch of air, seconds that seemed like hours, until finally a distant clang echoed back across the valley, sharp and undeniable, and the laughter stopped, replaced with stunned quiet as the spotter confirmed what they had refused to believe. The steel target at 2 miles bore the clean strike of her round, and she rolled her shoulder as if nothing extraordinary had happened, lowering the rifle with the same calm she had carried all along, while their mouths hung open and the arrogance drained from their faces, because in that moment the worthless rifle they had mocked had silenced all their pride and proven that belief, skill, and patience could still humble the most advanced weapons in the world. And she did not gloat, she did not even smile, she simply stood, dusted herself off and walked away, leaving behind only the echo of that shot and the truth that none of them would ever forget. The silence after her shot had been louder than any roar of applause could have been, and though the men tried to cover their shock with forced laughter and muttered excuses about luck or wind shift, the truth was carved into their faces, and she saw it clearly in their eyes, the first flicker of respect begrudgingly breaking through arrogance. But she didn't seek their respect, she only sought the challenge itself, because for her the rifle was not a tool to impress or humiliate, it was a bond to something greater, a reminder of discipline, survival, and legacy. Yet the instructors had seen enough to know this was not a fluke, so they raised the bar higher, ordering a moving target to be set up, a steel plate rigged on a track that would crawl across the far end of the valley, the kind of shot that even those with high-tech rifles struggled with, and again they called for volunteers, expecting silence, but before they finished speaking she was already stepping forward, the worn rifle once more in her hands, and murmurs rippled through the crowd, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others whispering that she was insane to try again, but she only lay down at her spot, steady as the earth beneath her, and waited for the signal, her eyes fixed on the horizon where the plate would appear, her mind already working through the calculations of distance, wind, movement, and timing, because to her this was not chance, it was art practiced over years, the art of stillness in a world that never stopped moving. And when the target emerged shimmering through the heat, creeping left to right across her field of vision, she drew a breath as though drawing in the valley itself, slowing her heart, letting the air out so gradually that the barrel of her rifle seemed to breathe with her, and then the shot cracked again, the echo rolling like thunder across the desert, the recoil a familiar companion, and the seconds of waiting stretched, silence gripping every onlooker until a fresh metallic strike rang out faint but undeniable, and gasps tore from the crowd as the target jerked under the impact, confirmed through the scope of the spotter, And once again she lowered the rifle with calm disinterest as though nothing more had happened than a stone tossed into a pond, while those who had doubted her found themselves staring not only at her rifle but at her, seeing not weakness but mastery born of something none of them had ever touched, a connection that was older than machines and stronger than arrogance. And though many wanted to believe it was luck again, the instructors cut them short, ordering silence, their own expressions marked with something close to awe, because they had seen hundreds of shooters over the years, thousands of attempts with modern technology, and yet here was a woman with a rifle they had dismissed as outdated achieving with calm certainty what others could not with all the advantages money could buy, and so they decided to push even further, setting the ultimate test, a sequence of 3 targets placed at staggering distances, one at 1.5 miles, one at just under 2 miles, and the last nearly 2.25 miles, daring her to try, thinking perhaps fatigue or overconfidence might finally break the streak, but when they asked for volunteers she did not hesitate, she simply nodded once and took her place, and the valley seemed to grow quieter with every step she took, as though even the wind was waiting to see if the impossible could be done, and when she lay down, placing the rifle against her shoulder, the world seemed to fall away again, her eyes narrowing, breath steady, body unmoving, and one by one the shots rang out, not rushed, not frantic but measured and exact, each crack of the rifle followed by that endless waiting silence until the faint distant strike confirmed the bullet had found its mark, and after the third and final clang rolled back like an echo from another world, no one dared to speak, no one dared to mock, no one dared even to breathe too loudly, because she had just written herself into legend before their eyes, and as she rose to her feet, brushing dust from her knees, the only sound was the hammering of hearts that knew they had witnessed something they would carry to their graves. The day a rifle they called worthless and a woman they called unworthy proved them all wrong, not once, not twice, but again and again, until disbelief shattered and silence bowed to undeniable truth. Word of her shots spread faster than fire across dry grass, and by the time the sun dipped behind the jagged ridges of the valley, her name was already being whispered through camps and corridors where soldiers gathered, men who had not even been present speaking of her as if they had seen her themselves, their voices tinged with disbelief and something that bordered on reverence. And while the stories grew in size with every retelling, she remained as calm as the steel in her hands, polishing the rifle by lantern light in silence, ignoring the curious eyes peeking in through the tent flaps, because she had never sought attention or praise, only the bond between shooter and rifle, between patience and distance. Yet the commanders noticed, and what commanders noticed quickly became orders, so when dawn broke the next morning she was summoned not to the training field but to the command post, where senior officers stood waiting with maps unrolled and grim expressions carved deep into their faces, and they told her the valley where she had proven herself was no longer just a place of training but the front line of a battle rising, that enemy spotters and snipers had been seen harassing supply convoys from positions so distant even drones struggled to mark them, and the men assigned to counter had failed repeatedly despite their advanced rifles, for the enemy shooters had mastered concealment and were striking with precision. And so the commanders asked her not as a request but as a necessity to take her rifle and show in real combat what she had done in practice. And though she knew the danger she did not hesitate, she nodded once, the same way she always did, as if the weight of death and life balanced no heavier than the rifle strap on her shoulder, and within the hour she was crawling belly down across scrub and rock toward the forward observation point, dust staining her face, her rifle pressed tight against her chest, and the men who accompanied her, spotters, scouts, and a pair of riflemen, looked to her with the quiet nervousness of those who know they are walking with someone who sees the world differently, someone who reads the air and the land with senses they cannot grasp. And when they reached the rise overlooking the valley, she unwrapped the cloth from her rifle and lay flat, letting her cheek sink into the stock, closing one eye and letting the other travel across the jagged ridges in search of the faintest disturbance, and soon she found it, a shimmer where heat bent wrong, a flicker of light off glass hidden beneath camouflage netting, and she whispered the location without lifting her voice, and the spotters squinted, struggling to see what she saw, but they trusted her because by now disbelief had no place around her, and as the enemy shot cracked a moment later and a puff of dust jumped from the earth just feet away, she was already breathing deep, timing the pulse of her body to the shifting wind, and when she squeezed the trigger the sound was swallowed by distance, the bullet carrying itself over miles of air until far across the valley a figure slumped, motionless, the glint of the hidden scope vanishing into silence, and her team stared not at the enemy fall but at her calm face, unshaken, already shifting her rifle slightly, scanning again, and before they even caught their breath she found the second shooter, this one tucked into the shadow of a cliff, half concealed by stone, but the shadow betrayed him, and again her rifle cracked, again the seconds dragged, and again the silence ended with a strike that ended a threat, and the valley seemed to hold its breath as the danger receded, and in that moment her team understood what the others had begun to whisper, that she was more than a shooter, more than a soldier. She was a force of patience and certainty, carrying an old rifle that should not have been capable of what it did, yet in her hands it was like an extension of the earth itself, and by the time they returned to the post the commanders did not mock, did not question, they simply listened, because she had proven what they could not deny, that skill born of discipline and belief could cut deeper and truer than any technology. And as night fell again and she sat alone with her rifle across her knees, the camp around her buzzing with voices telling and retelling the shots she had made that day, she remained quiet, eyes on the stars above, as if already searching for the next distance she would one day be called upon to reach. The following days turned into a trial of endurance as much as skill, because once word of her shots reached the enemy they grew cautious, shifting their positions, hiding deeper into the mountains, forcing her to stretch both patience and perception beyond even what she had been trained for, and each time she was summoned to the forward post she knew it meant another test, another unseen duel with opponents who understood the land and the distances as well as she did, perhaps even better, but what set her apart was not equipment or luck, it was the way she treated each shot as if it were a conversation between herself and the world, listening more than she spoke, waiting longer than anyone else dared to wait, and soon her legend spread not only among her own but among the enemy as well, for scouts brought back reports of whispered warnings carried through intercepted radios, voices speaking of a ghost rifle, of a woman whose bullet could cross valleys and tear through shadows, and fear had begun to creep into men who once mocked her, fear that grew into hesitation whenever they dared to lift their scopes, but fear made them reckless too, and one night under a half-moon her team was roused with urgency. Enemy infiltrators had pushed closer than ever, slipping between ridges under the cover of darkness, harassing convoys with quick ambushes, vanishing before the patrols could pin them down, and so she and her spotter moved out under the pale glow of the stars, crawling through dirt and thorny brush until their bodies blended with the earth, and for long hours they lay in silence, unmoving, until faint footsteps and murmured voices drifted across the still air, and she lifted her rifle, slow and steady, the barrel tracing sound before sight, and then shadows emerged, 3 figures against the pale rock, rifles slung, confident they were unseen, but in that instant she exhaled and the crack of her rifle split the night. One fell, another stumbled, the third scattering in confusion before her second shot sent him tumbling, and silence returned as sudden as it had been broken, and her spotter whispered that she had saved the convoy route, but she only nodded, adjusting her rifle again because she knew there would be more, and they came, again and again. Each encounter stretching the limits of her rifle, each forcing her to weigh the air, the moonlight, the terrain, until shooting no longer felt like aiming at targets but like touching the threads of fate itself, plucking them with her trigger finger, altering the weave of lives across impossible distance. And when the commanders asked her how she did it she gave no lectures, no explanations, she only told them to breathe with the earth, because the earth never lied, and though few understood, none doubted, because doubt had no place left in the presence of what she had done, and yet with every shot, every victory she felt the weight on her shoulders grow heavier, not because of pride but because of responsibility, for she had become not just a soldier among many but a symbol whispered through camps on both sides, a figure the enemy feared and her comrades leaned upon, and in the quiet of her tent when she laid the rifle across her knees she would sometimes trace her fingers over the scratches her grandfather had left on the stock, remembering his words, that a rifle is not meant to carry glory but to carry burden, and she understood now what he had meant, because each shot that rang true meant a life ended far away, a threat silenced, a danger removed, but also a soul departing into silence, and though she did not waver, though her aim never faltered, she never allowed herself to forget the cost of her skill, and that was what kept her steady when others might have broken, the memory of legacy and the acceptance of burden. And so when dawn broke after another night of duels in the valley, the camp rose not to jeer her old rifle but to watch her walk by in silence, their eyes following not with mockery but with a respect so heavy it felt like reverence, as if they knew they were walking beside something that would be told in stories long after their own names had been forgotten. By the time weeks had passed her name had become something more than just a rumor, it was a presence felt even when she was not there, and every new recruit who joined the camp heard the same warning whispered around fires, that somewhere out in the valley a woman with an old rifle could see farther and strike truer than any scope could manage, and while she ignored the whispers and went about her tasks with quiet discipline, the commanders began to rely on her as though she were not just a soldier but an entire weapon system of her own, calling her forward whenever convoys moved through dangerous routes or whenever patrols reported glints of glass high in the mountains, and each time she went she never failed, her shots echoing across the valley like the toll of a distant bell, sharp and final. But with every mission the enemy grew more desperate, determined to erase the ghost who haunted them, and soon reports came that they had dispatched their most skilled marksmen, men armed with rifles generations ahead of hers, optics capable of seeing through haze and wind, guided by devices that calculated distances in moments, and when those men arrived the duels changed, no longer just simple hunts but intricate dances of patience and deception, hours of lying still under burning sun, watching and waiting, her body pressed so flat against the earth that ants crawled across her skin unnoticed, her breath slowed to the rhythm of leaves stirring in the breeze, until the faintest mistake betrayed a hidden rifle far away, and then her fingers squeezed the trigger with the inevitability of falling rain, but she knew now she was hunted as much as she hunted, because twice shots had whispered past so close she could feel the air shift against her cheek, and twice her team had urged her to pull back, yet she stayed, steady and unbroken, because retreat meant giving up ground, and giving up ground meant convoys lost and comrades dead, so she bore the risk, and when she finally found the men sent to kill her, hidden in shadows with rifles gleaming like snakes, she did not rush, she waited, she outlasted them, and one by one their rifles fell silent, their bodies collapsing into the dust, and word spread back across the lines that even the best had failed, that the ghost rifle still lived, and with that the fear grew deeper, until even hardened veterans flinched at the thought of raising a scope into the valley, and though victory seemed certain, she felt no triumph, only the steady heaviness of duty, because with every duel she saw her comrades looking at her not as one of them but as something different, set apart, and in their respect she felt loneliness begin to creep in, for no one laughed with her anymore, no one spoke casually, they only nodded in awe or silence as if afraid to treat her as ordinary, and so she returned each night to her tent and her rifle, polishing the steel with care, whispering to the wood as though it were still her grandfather beside her, reminding herself that she was human, that she was flesh and bone and not the legend they made of her, but deep inside she knew the truth, that the legend was no longer hers to control, it had grown beyond her, carried by every shot she fired, and soon even her commanders spoke not of strategies but of simply sending her, as though her presence alone shifted the balance, and while she accepted it without protest she began to feel the edge of fatigue, not in her body but in her spirit, because carrying the weight of belief was heavier than any rifle. Yet she did not falter, because faltering would mean the story ended, and stories like hers were not meant to end quietly, they were meant to carve themselves into history with the same finality as a bullet striking steel across impossible distance. The turning point came when the enemy, weary of losing duel after duel, changed their strategy and decided not to face her across the valley anymore but to strike directly at the camp where she stayed, sending infiltrators under the cover of a sandstorm that rolled across the desert like a living wall, choking out sight and sound, and as the wind howled and grit scoured the tents, alarms rose, shouts cutting through the roar as soldiers scrambled to positions, and she emerged into the storm with her rifle clutched close, eyes narrowed against the stinging dust, her mind sharper than ever, because this was no longer about patience and distance but about speed and clarity in chaos, and while others fired blindly into the shifting storm, she crouched low, her ears straining, her senses stretched, feeling the vibrations of footsteps more than hearing them, and when she caught the silhouette of a figure moving where no ally should be she lifted her rifle without hesitation. The crack lost inside the storm's scream but the shape collapsing told her all she needed, and she moved again, crawling, shifting, never staying where the enemy might expect, her rifle steady even as the storm tried to tear it from her hands, and one by one the infiltrators fell, each bullet placed not by sight alone but by instinct sharpened from years of breathing with the earth, and when the storm finally broke and the sun burned back through the haze, the camp was battered but still standing, the infiltrators scattered in lifeless silence, and her comrades looked at her with a reverence even deeper than before, because she had proven that her skill was not bound only to clear skies and distant targets but thrived even in the chaos where no one else could see, and though they cheered, though they clapped her on the back, she felt only the deepening quiet inside her, the knowledge that every victory tied her more tightly to the role she had not sought, the role of myth made flesh. And that night as she sat outside her tent staring at the horizon she wondered if perhaps the rifle had chosen her more than she had chosen it, as though the legacy carved into its stock had pulled her life down this path, and yet when the commanders approached her with new orders she did not refuse, because duty did not bend to doubt. The orders were simple but heavy. The enemy had established a hidden base in the far cliffs beyond the valley, fortified with spotters and marksmen to guard their supply lines, and every attempt to strike them had failed, the losses mounting too high. So they asked her to go, not with an army but with only a small team, to slip through the ridges, find the vantage, and break the defenses from afar, and though others might have questioned the risk, she only nodded once, because the task fit her like the rifle fit her shoulder, and before dawn, she was moving again, her team of 4 following in silence, trusting her without words, and for 3 days they crawled through gullies and over ridges, surviving on little, their bodies raw with fatigue, until at last they reached the overlook where the enemy base spread below, faint lights flickering in the darkness, the movement of guards barely visible, and while her comrades whispered in awe of the challenge, she simply lay down, adjusted the stock against her cheek, and began to breathe. With the earth again, the sound of her heart steady, the barrel aligned with shadows far below, and when the first shot rang out it was not just a bullet but a message, a strike that cut open the silence of the cliffs and threw the enemy into chaos. And as they scrambled, searching for a ghost they could not see, she kept firing, each shot deliberate, each strike breaking their defenses piece by piece until the base below erupted in confusion, and her comrades moved in to finish what she had begun, the mission that had seemed impossible completed with the calm precision of a woman and a rifle once mocked as worthless. And by the time they returned to their camp the commanders no longer looked at her as just a soldier but as a weapon forged by patience and belief, something rare and irreplaceable. And though she accepted their praise with silence, inside she only felt the same steady truth she had carried since the beginning, that she was not legend or myth, only a woman who had learned to breathe with the world and listen long enough for the bullet to find its place. Her victories on the cliffs should have marked the end of her trial, but instead they only deepened the legend, and with legend came expectation heavier than any pack or rifle she could carry, because now wherever she walked the camp fell silent, men staring with the mix of awe and fear reserved for something no longer seen as human, and while she bore it with her usual quiet, she felt the isolation grow. Her comrades speaking to her in hushed tones, never casually, never like a friend, always like they addressed a shadow that could slip away at any moment, and though she never showed it, she missed the simple laughter that had once followed her before the first impossible shot. She missed being ordinary, yet she carried on because duty did not bend for longing, and soon a new test arrived, one greater than any before. 4 scouts reported that the enemy had stationed their own most feared marksman across the valley, a shooter known only by a call sign whispered with dread, a man said to have never missed at ranges where others failed, armed with the finest rifle money and science could provide, and the commanders told her plainly that this duel would decide more than pride, it would decide whether convoys lived or died, whether ground was held or lost, and so she prepared as she always did, no fanfare, no bravado, only the quiet rituals of checking her rifle, polishing the stock, running a cloth over the barrel, each motion a conversation with her grandfather's memory, each touch a reminder of why she carried the weapon when others had abandoned such relics. And when dawn bled across the valley she was already lying flat in the dust, her spotter beside her, the air still as glass, the world waiting, and across the distance she felt him, the unseen rival, another presence breathing slow, waiting, watching, and the duel stretched long into the day, hours passing without a single shot, both hunters locked in patience, each knowing the first to move would likely be the first to fall, and sweat trickled down her temple, dust caked her lips, yet she did not move, not even when the sun scorched her back, not even when her muscles ached, because she knew the valley, she trusted it, and as afternoon stretched into evening the faintest glint betrayed him, a shimmer no one else could have noticed, a mistake born not of lack of skill but of time's relentless weight, and in that instant she exhaled, her finger tightening with the inevitability of storms, the crack of her rifle rolling across the silence, and the world seemed to hold its breath until far away a figure shifted and slumped, the legend of the enemy's ghost falling still into the dust, and her spotter whispered in disbelief that she had done it, that the duel everyone feared had ended with a single shot, but she only adjusted her rifle and scanned again, calm and steady as if nothing extraordinary had happened, because in her heart she knew the duel had been less about skill than about who could carry the burden longer, who could wait until the valley itself chose, and when they returned to camp that evening the silence was deeper than ever, not mocking, not even celebratory, but reverent, as though they were in the presence of something sacred, and though she longed to remind them she was just flesh and blood, she said nothing, because she had learned long ago that words could never shift belief once it rooted in men's hearts, and so she carried the weight of her growing myth with the same patience she carried her rifle, step by steady step, breath by steady breath, knowing that though she had defeated the rival sent to end her, the true battle was not against enemies across the valley but against the loneliness building inside her with every shot that proved she was something more than the ordinary woman she longed to be. The duel that ended her rival should have brought her peace, but instead it carved her deeper into legend, and with every passing day she felt herself pulled further from the soldier she once was and into the ghost they now believed her to be, and though her commanders praised her as a decisive factor in the war, though her comrades followed her with reverence bordering on worship, she began to understand that her life was no longer her own, it belonged to the story people told of her, the myth that grew with every shot across impossible distance, yet still she carried on because the war demanded it, and one final mission awaited, the most dangerous yet, for scouts had discovered the enemy's last fortified line stretched across a canyon, protected by layers of marksmen, machine guns and artillery, and no assault could succeed unless those defenses were broken, and the commanders turned to her with the weight of desperate hope in their eyes, asking her not as an order but as a plea, because only her rifle could reach what no other could, and though she felt the burden press heavy on her shoulders, she did not hesitate, she nodded once as she always did, because she had never been one to turn away when duty called, and before dawn she was already on the ridge, her spotter at her side, the canyon yawning open below, filled with shadows that hid death at every corner, and she lay flat against the earth, the worn rifle pressed close, her cheek against the stock that carried her grandfather's marks, and she breathed, long and steady, as the first light of morning painted the rocks in blood-red hues, and then she began her work, patient and relentless, her shots cracking one after another, each one finding its mark with surgical certainty, enemy spotters falling before they could relay positions, machine gunners slumping before they could pin down advancing allies, artillery crews collapsing before they could fire, and the canyon echoed with chaos as the enemy scrambled, confused and terrified by a shooter they could not see, a ghost whose bullets carved through their strongest line, and as hours stretched on she kept firing, her body aching, her lips dry, her eyes burning from the dust, but her aim never faltered, and slowly, with every strike, the canyon defenses crumbled, until at last her comrades surged forward, charging across the broken line, victory rolling with them like a wave, and the enemy broke, retreating into shadows, leaving the canyon in silence, and her name echoed across the valley in voices that shook with awe, because they knew they had witnessed the impossible yet again, that one woman with a rifle once mocked as worthless had undone an entire fortress, and when the dust cleared and the battle was won she lowered her rifle, staring across the endless horizon, her face calm but her heart heavy because she knew what came next. The war would end someday, the guns would fall silent, but her story would not, it would be told and retold, growing larger with every tongue that spoke it, until the woman was lost inside the myth, and though she longed for the simplicity of the days when her rifle was only her grandfather's gift, when she was just another voice among soldiers, she accepted the truth with the same patience she had always carried, because some burdens could not be put down, and as night fell and the camp celebrated in wild relief, she sat apart, polishing the rifle by firelight, whispering to it as though it still carried her grandfather's voice, thanking it not for glory but for carrying her through every trial, and in the quiet she smiled faintly, not for victory, not for legend, but for the bond that had never broken, the bond between a shooter and her rifle, between patience and distance, between breath and silence, and she knew that even if the world remembered her as a ghost, she would always remember herself as nothing more than a woman who had learned to listen to the earth and trusted enough to hit what no one else believed could be touched. The end.